Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Herzlich willkommen zum heutigen Vortrag in der virtuellen Ringvorlesung der Universität Göttingen. Ein Virus verändert die Welt. Göttinger Wissenschaftlerinnen zur Corona-Pandemie. Mein Name ist Ben Lühring und ich moderiere diese digitale Ringvorlesung im Wechsel mit meiner Kollegin Regina Lange, die sich heute im Hintergrund um ihre Fragen an unseren Redner kümmern wird. Der Titel des heutigen Vortrags von Professor Andrew Gross vom Seminar für englische Philologie lautet Benjamin Franklin, Smallpox Inoculation and the Public Good. Andrew Gross, Zoom makes it possible, joining us from his home office in Berlin. Welcome. Ist seit 2015 Professor für Nordamerika-Studien an der Universität Göttingen. Zu seinen Forschungsschwerpunkten zählen unter anderem Reiseliteratur und die Kulturgeschichte des Kalten Krieges. Gegenwärtig forscht er zu literarischen Darstellungen von Liberalismus vom 18. Jahrhundert bis in die Gegenwart. Während wir in der vergangenen Woche über Albert Camus' Die Pest gehört haben, wird es heute um ein Thema gehen, das nicht in aller Munde ist und trotzdem eine sehr spannende Perspektive bietet. Einer der ersten Amerikaner, der über die Ausbreitung von Epidemien schrieb und diese bekämpfte, war Benjamin Franklin, der 1766 auch Göttingen besuchte. Als junger Mann war er jedoch eng mit den Gegnern der Impfung verbunden. Im zeitgenössischen Sprachgebrauch wäre der junge Franklin ein Anti-Vaxxer, ein Impfgegner gewesen. Seine Haltung postete er nicht auf Twitter oder Instagram, sondern publizierte sie in Journalen und erreichte auf diesem Weg eine große Öffentlichkeit. Was seine Meinung änderte, war seine Bereitschaft, wissenschaftliche Erkenntnisse in Betracht zu ziehen. Der Zusammenstoß seiner eigenen Familie mit den Pocken brachte zudem große persönliche Tragödien mit sich, da eines seiner beiden Kinder im Alter von nur 4 Jahren starb. Gleichzeitig versuchte er, sein Leben als Fallstudie zu betrachten. Dieser distanzierte Blick auf das Selbst findet sich auch in Franklins berühmter Autobiografie. Benjamin Franklin hätte sich mit Sicherheit intensiv und differenziert in die gegenwärtigen Lockerungsdebatten eingemischt. 2 organisatorische Hinweise noch vorab. Der heutige Vortrag findet in englischer Sprache statt. But now, Andrew, the stream, the floor is yours.
First, hi, Mom. I'm glad to have you with us from Phoenix. Wir kennen Franklin als Wissenschaftler und als Held der amerikanischen Revolution. Es ist weniger bekannt, dass er als Impfgegner angefangen hat. Später änderte er seine Meinung, aber sein Protest hat ihn geprägt. Heute werde ich über diese Geschichte erzählen. Der Vortrag ist im Englisch, aber ich freue mich auf Fragen auf Deutsch. Benjamin Franklin was a founding father, a hero of the Enlightenment, the tamer of lightning, the inventor of bifocals and the Franklin stove, the author of a famous autobiography, and a visitor to Göttingen in 1766. That much is common knowledge. What is less frequently noted is that he was deeply involved in the fight against and about smallpox. I say about because, surprisingly, Franklin opposed inoculation during the Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721. He was a young man at the time, and the procedure was new. But he was also an anti-vaxxer, and thus the intellectual precursor of those who refused to vaccinate their children and who will probably refuse the COVID-19 vaccine should one be developed. Franklin valued personal liberty, which is the rallying cry of today's anti-vaxxers. He nevertheless became a major proponent of inoculation in his mature years. What changed his mind was the willingness to consider new evidence that made him a successful scientist. Of equal importance, however, was his work as a publicist and his understanding of how publics come into being through the circulation of texts. What the internet is today, books, pamphlets, periodicals, and letters were in the 18th century. These texts circulate among publics in ways that allow people to communicate over great distances. We sometimes talk of information going viral or of progress being infectious. However, Franklin's example teaches that the spread of infection should be carefully distinguished from the spread of ideas. Franklin did not have the benefit of modern diagnostics. He might not have known that a virus limited to human carriers, like the variola or smallpox virus, prefers tightly packed human biomass. However, he did know that while sickness is caught, ideas are communicated, and that communication thrives on structures, hierarchies, and networks that give people something in common while providing them with the means to stay apart. In what follows, I will argue that Franklin's work as a publicist put him in a good position to understand how inoculation differs from infection. With his audience in mind, he was able to take a public view of private life, regarding himself and others from a distance as case studies rather than as protagonists in first-person narratives. This explains why he was willing to apply statistical data to his own life and why his autobiography is impersonal in ways that have puzzled critics and delighted readers for centuries. Now, the Boston smallpox epidemic of 1721 posed both a physical threat to the community and an interpretive threat to Puritan orthodoxy. A century earlier, the colonists saw smallpox as a godsend. John Winthrop, who was arguably the most important Puritan leader in early New England, called smallpox a miraculous plague, and he believed that God sent it to North America to clear the land of Indians for the settlers. But what to make of smallpox 100 years later when it reached epidemic proportions in Boston? Cotton Mather, the leading minister of the community, observed patterns of infection that, intentionally or not, cast doubt on the theological explanation of sickness as a part of God's plan. Noting that Europe blamed America for the great pox, that is to say syphilis, Mather countered that America could blame Europe for the smallpox. He was right. Medical historians attribute the periodicity of American epidemics to herd immunity. In large cities like London, where smallpox never completely disappeared, children tended to get the disease in their infancy. Those who survived were immune for life and formed living barriers so that outbreaks rarely reached epidemic proportions. The case was very different amongst the sparsely settled communities of North America. The first generation of settlers brought the disease with them, unleashing devastating epidemics among native populations. However, subsequent generations, born of immune parents, were never exposed until a ship arrived carrying the disease on board. That's exactly what happened when the HMS Seahorse landed in Boston Harbor on the 22nd of April, 1721, with one crew member sick with smallpox. By late June, as one historian puts it, the epidemic had taken on a life of its own. And by the time it receded later that year, roughly 6,000 of Boston's 11,000 inhabitants had been infected, and nearly 850 of them had died. Mather proposed combating the epidemic with inoculation. He seems to have learned of the procedure from two different sources. One was a report of Lady Montague's experiences in Constantinople, published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. He also learned of the procedure from the servant he called Onesimus, who was inoculated in Africa before being kidnapped and sold into slavery. At that time, there were slaves in the north as well as in the south. The procedure, as Mather understood it, was simple, but not always very safe. It involved taking pus from the sore of a mildly infected person and inserting it under the skin of someone not yet exposed to the disease. The result was infection, but usually in a minor and localized form. Mather enlisted a doctor named Boylston, who performed the first inoculations in Boston, testing the procedure on his own 6-year-old son, on one of his slaves, and on the son of his slave. They acquired immunity. Buoyed by this success, Mather and Boylston initiated the first drive for public inoculation. City officials soon forbade the practice, but the experiment was successful. About 1 in 9 people died in the natural course of infection. Of the 286 people inoculated, the mortality rate was 1 in 48. However, the procedure was controversial, and the long incubation period of the disease made it difficult to determine the precise causes of infection. This resulted in a widespread newspaper and pamphlet war over who died, when, and why. Some objected correctly that the careless inoculation practices were actually spreading infection. Others objected on more theoretical grounds. Those of a religious mindset feared that infecting yourself might be tantamount to thwarting God's will. The biblical injunction against harming others also seemed to apply. In many of the pamphlets, the medical and religious positions are interwoven, demonstrating that science had not yet developed its own distinct method or discursive style. Leading the opposition was a group of young artisans, businessmen, and professionals who rallied around Boston's first independent newspaper, the New-England Courant. The paper was published by Benjamin Franklin's older brother, James. The first issue appeared on August 7th, 1721, at the height of the inoculation controversy. The second issue, published August 14th, features a satirical piece offering to pay inoculators to infect Indian tribes. This kind of aggressive satire was not uncommon, and its primary targets, even in this horrific vision of germ warfare, were actually members of the Boston community. Tempers flared, positions hardened. Mather's allies dubbed the anti-inoculators the Hellfire Club. James Franklin faced possible libel charges, and Mather's father, a leading minister in his own right, predicted that God would annihilate Franklin for his sins. Boylston and Mather faced more immediate forms of violence. Boylston narrowly avoided being lynched, and Mather had his own brush with death when somebody threw a bomb through his window, an actual bomb through his window with a note attached, "Cotton Mather, you dog, damn you, I'll inoculate you with this, and a pox to you too." Luckily for Mather, the bomb did not blow up. The intensity of this debate, which I think puts our current Twitter debates into perspective, shouldn't be surprising. With over half the population infected in the course of about 6 months, everybody knew somebody who was scarred by pox, at risk, or dead. The threat of infection was acute enough to necessitate a coordinated public response. Recommending inoculation as a step that everyone could take, Mather helped call that public into being. He also motivated a counter-public made up of individuals who, concerned for their personal safety, envisioned a very different kind of response. The argument against inoculation served as a host for other conflicts that had been brewing for a long time. The New England Courant had an axe to grind with the Mathers, and sensing public uncertainty, James Franklin seized the opportunity to challenge their authority, first in medical matters, but then in general. At the height of the controversy, James Franklin linked the pernicious influence of the Mathers to a whole host of crises going back to the Salem witchcraft trials, where they had played less than noble roles. Ironically, Mather's belief in witchcraft, or what he called the wonders of the invisible world, may have made him a better diagnostician than his critics. Historians usually take sides in the inoculation debate, endorsing either the anti-elitism of James Franklin or the scientific insight of Cotton Mather. Benjamin Franklin, however, learned something from both sides, namely that arguments depend not only on logic and evidence, but also on the size and the influence of the groups supporting them. When he moved to Philadelphia and eventually started his own publishing business and newspaper, Franklin devoted much of his energy to forming clubs, public institutions, and networks. He tailored his arguments to match the evidence, but also to match his audiences. Now, like others in the original anti-inoculator circle, Franklin actually became a staunch supporter of inoculation in the 1730s, so about a decade later. While historians have been unable to determine exactly when he changed his mind or why, it is clear that he began to think about the public in an aggregate way, rather than in stark contrast to private liberty. The change reflected his growing importance as a publisher and his efforts to expand his audience to include as much of the public as possible. But it also had a tragic dimension. Franklin encouraged the people of Philadelphia to inoculate their children, but he hesitated in the case of his own son, Frankie, who was too sickly to undergo the risky procedure. Frankie died of smallpox during a Philadelphia epidemic. This Franklin reports in part 3 of his autobiography, composed the same year he wrote his last will and testament, and less than 2 years before his death. Quote, "In 1736, I lost one of my sons, a fine boy of 4 years old, by the smallpox taken in the common way. The common way is by infection rather than inoculation. I long regretted bitterly and still regret that I had not given it to him by inoculation. This I mention for the sake of parents who omit that operation on the supposition that they should never forgive themselves if a child died under it. My example showing that the regret may be the same either way, and that therefore the safer should be chosen." This passage shows Franklin was haunted for his entire life by feelings of guilt. His grief is emotionally palpable, but it also serves as data. Franklin qualifies his personal testimony as soon as he utters it. Quantifies is an even better term. He makes public sense of private misfortune by analyzing the probability of death and the calculable weight of grief. Franklin's admission, in other words, is also a calculation, and its impersonal statistical form carries it across the centuries as an anti-inoculator's final warning to the anti-vaxxers. The public form of Franklin's grief is significant in at least 3 ways. First, it encouraged him to become more active in the cause of inoculation. Historians believe that Franklin's example influenced George Washington, who ordered the mass inoculation of troops in 1777, the first state-sponsored immunization campaign in history. Franklin may have also influenced Jefferson, who would go on to support Edward Jenner's improved procedure of using non-fatal cowpox to vaccinate against smallpox, hence the name vaccination, from the Latin vacca, for cow. Second, the public form of Franklin's grief is useful for explaining why smallpox surfaces in surprising places in his writing, such as in his instructions for building the famous Franklin or Pennsylvania fireplace, which doubles actually as a treatise on public health. Third, I want to argue that the autobiography is a record of infection, even in places where Franklin does not mention disease. Franklin internalized his method of engaging in public health debates as a metric of private behavior. The decisive text in Franklin's public campaign is his preface to Dr. Heberden's pamphlet on inoculation, written while he was in London in 1759. Heberden, one of Franklin's many acquaintances, was an early health crusader who printed the pamphlet at his own cost. Inoculation was expensive in the 18th century, so Heberden wanted to give people information on how to perform the procedure themselves. If you can imagine, he was sending them to find infected people, take the pus from a sore, and then insert it subcutaneously. Franklin supported Heberden's efforts and sent copies with his own preface attached to Pennsylvania and Boston for free distribution. There are traces of the old Boston controversy in Franklin's text, including arguments designed to allay religious scruples and reference to the work of Dr. Boylston. Franklin clearly builds on his personal experience, but he also mobilizes the impersonal data of statistics in his efforts to persuade. The charts and numeric comparisons are part of an emerging style of scientific discourse, and their method facilitates imagining the public in new ways. For instance, those statistics compare the infection and mortality rates of Black and white inhabitants, suggesting an epidemiological equivalency between the two populations, as well as racialized differences. The statistical equivalency did not yet translate into political or social equality, but it is likely that Franklin's embrace of mathematical comparisons affected his own attitudes towards equality, as late in life, he became an outspoken abolitionist, somebody who opposed slavery. Franklin mobilizes this data for the purpose of what he calls strict and impartial inquiry, while revealing his personal investment in the cause. The mixture of the impersonal with the personal culminates in a passage that anticipates the autobiography in its statistical and pathos-laden appeal to anti-inoculators. Quote, "On the whole, if the chance were only as 2-to-1 in favor of the practice among children, would it not be sufficient to induce a tender parent to lay hold of the advantage? But when it is so much greater, as it appears to be by these accounts, in some even as 30-to-1, surely parents will no longer refuse to accept and thankfully use a discovery God in his mercy has been pleased to bless mankind with." Earlier, I noted that Cotton Mather's belief in the invisible world of witchcraft made him more sensitive to the microscopic world of infection. Here, Franklin, speaking to the tender parent and as a tender parent, moves from statistics to a God who blesses through evidence rather than through revelation. There is some ideological convergence between the early inoculator and the apostate. However, their agreement is less significant than the revolution that has occurred in the public sphere. If Franklin takes up some of Mather's arguments, he does not speak like him from the pulpit, nor does he demand faith in reason. Rather, he speaks as a member of the public he addresses. Philadelphians knew the fate of his son, and while Frankie does not show up in the charts of the preface, he is a silent statistic, palpable in Franklin's probabilistic explanation of how a tender parent should act. This distant or statistical attitude towards his own experiences is characteristic of Franklin's mature public life, and it influences the strangely impersonal style of his autobiography. A case in point is the famous table of virtues in part 2. The format evokes the charts Franklin presents in the preface to the inoculation pamphlet. Indeed, the table provides an opportunity for a particular kind of self-presentation, which shows Franklin had absorbed the statistical relation to himself as method and style. Now, scholars since Max Weber have seen the self-discipline represented by this early form of life tracking, really, as a form of self-negation. I would counter that it gives Franklin the means to manage personal problems, whether viruses or vices, by considering them from a public perspective. It is significant that Franklin transferred his original table of virtues drawn on paper to one etched on ivory that he kept about him at all times, even after he ceased to use it. Franklin's autobiography is another such memento, carried around by his many readers as a token and as a method. The autobiography has been influential because it treats Franklin's life as a case study and proposes methods for correcting problems that might confront anyone, anywhere. It is designed to help readers inoculate themselves against their own vices, in part because its public perspective can be engrafted into the lives of people who never come into contact with each other. Franklin began as an anti-inoculator, but in the end, he differs from the anti-vaxxers by viewing private liberty as a public good. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for this wide-spanning and interesting presentation. It showed all of the different aspects, kind of the development Franklin made through his life. You're welcome. Sie können Ihre Fragen nun unten stellen mit der F&A-Frage. We'll switch languages all the time, I guess. Und ich habe hier auch schon, erreicht schon die erste Frage, die wir vielleicht, genau, es dankt jemand für den interessanten Vortrag, aber die Frage ist, what did you read during the last weeks? Was haben Sie gelesen in den letzten Wochen?
It's a wonderful question. It's an important question. I know it was a question last week as well.
Yes.
I have kind of the advantage of teaching this semester a course on literature of the apocalypse. So I've been reading a lot of novels dealing with the end. Among them, one on my desk right now, one that I would really recommend is Cormac McCarthy's The Road. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book about a relationship between parent and child, father and son. Kind of a scaled down narrative that takes you to almost the existential minimum of what survival means. And it's actually more hopeful than you would think. Other books about endings, there are many to choose from. I particularly like Colson Whitehead has become famous for his book Underground Railroad a couple years ago, but he wrote an earlier novel about the zombie apocalypse called Zone 1, which I think is really wonderful, and I would recommend that. There's also a theoretical book that I think is really about as beautiful as theory can be. It's a book that you can actually take to bed with you and read as you're going to sleep, and you can't say that about all literary criticism. And it's Frank Kermode's Sense of an Ending, which kind of reviews biblical and literary notions of the apocalypse and what we think about when we think of endings. Kermode makes the important point that even literary figures who picture the ending, who picture catastrophe, are actually commenting on the here and now. And so you have to read stories about threats and catastrophes as social commentaries on the present. So I would start there. There's a book by Naomi Alderman called The Power that's also wonderful. Octavia Butler has a series of environmental apocalyptic novels that are telling. I find these books help put the current crisis in perspective.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This question that is related to the witchcraft discussion. Do you have evidence that the medical development influenced the witchcraft discussion?
Oh God, that's a great question. My goodness. I mean, I assert in this paper, and I'm not the only one, that because Mather believed in invisible forces emanating from God or the devil, that he had a kind of an insight into the way germs worked, and in fact was a proponent of what was called the animalculi theory, kind of a proto-germ theory in the 18th century. There have been a lot of medical theories about the witchcraft trials, including when I was a kid in high school, people said that they ate they must have eaten some infected grain and they were hallucinating. I'm sure there are much more sophisticated theories than that. I don't know them. I wish I did. Thank you for the question. That's something that I should research.
Eine ganz spannende Frage, die so ein bisschen auch aufzeigt, dass wir sehr unterschiedliche Forschungszusammenhänge manchmal haben. Die Amerikanistik, Ihr Forschungsfach, Ihr Fach, beschäftigt sich die Amerikanistik aktuell mit der Pandemie? Also auch in den USA, ist das ein Thema oder ist man im Homeoffice und in seinen Zusammenhängen?
Es ist ein großes Thema und auf mehrerer Ebene. Ich meine, es gibt eine große Bedrohung in Amerika an die Universitäten als Finanzwesen, weil die Studierenden bezahlen viel mehr Geld, dort zu studieren. Und wenn die nicht zurückkommen im Herbst, dann gibt es überhaupt kein Geld. Und das ist eine Riesenkrise. So auf dieser Verwaltungsebene gibt es eine sehr häufige Diskussion. In meinem Fach, in Amerikanistik, man redet in verschiedene Richtungen. Es ist natürlich sehr politisch und es gibt ganz viel Kritik über, wie das momentan verwaltet oder nicht verwaltet wird von Trump und die amerikanische Regierung. Es gibt, Amerikanistik ist ein interessantes Fach, weil es geht nicht nur um Literaturwissenschaft, aber auch um Politikwissenschaft und Soziologie. Und aus diesen verschiedenen Richtungen sind die Diskussionen sehr politisch. Und Sie können das selber wahrscheinlich vorstellen, die Bahnbreite dieser verschiedenen Diskussionen. Aber es ist meistens sehr kritisch, über wie das behandelt wird in Amerika. Das kann ich grob sagen.
Sie haben in Ihrem Vortrag über Individualität und persönliche Freiheitsrechte letztlich auch gesprochen, die in den USA ja auch seit jeher ein sehr hohes Gut sind. Und Franklin hat Statistik und Religion miteinander verknüpft. Bietet das ein Beispiel, das Beispiel Benjamin Franklin, Hinweise dafür, wie ein erfolgreicher Umgang, eine erfolgreiche Kommunikation über und mit der Pandemie in Amerika gelingen kann? Das ist ja mittlerweile das am stärksten betroffene Land.
Wegen die starke religiöse Prägung, meinen Sie wahrscheinlich, oder? Ja, das ist ein schwieriges Thema. Es gibt ein sehr gutes Buch von einer ehemaligen Fellow Graduate Student von mir, Jennifer Reich, das heißt Calling the Shots. Und es ist eine soziologische Untersuchung, warum ganz viele Leute in Amerika verweigern, sich die Impfungen für ihre Kinder zu erlauben. Ganz viel, nicht nur, aber ganz viel von diesen Leuten sind sehr religiös, aber es ist eine bestimmte religiöse Strömung. Man nennt die Fundamentalisten in Amerika, die sind protestantisch, typisch die Kommunisten aus der Großstadt normalerweise, eher aus Rural Areas und kleinen Städten. Und ein ganz starker Teil Methodist, Baptist, verschiedene Richtungen, aber ein ganz starker Glaube ist die Glaube an eine ganz persönliche Verbindung zwischen Mann und Gott. Dass man kann quasi mit Gott reden und seine Wünsche, wenn man darauf wirklich offen ist, entziffern. Und das ist politisch gesehen, ist dieser Glauben sehr, sehr individualistisch, weil es geht um diese individuelle Beziehung mit Gott. Und die sind meistens Libertarians, würde man das nennen in Amerika. Die sind gegen alle Formen von Verwaltung und Governmentality. Und deswegen verweigern sie alle Eingriffe, die sie als Eingriffe wahrnehmen in ihrem Familien- und privaten Leben. So Franklin als Beispiel für diese Leute, das glaube ich nicht. Er war eigentlich deistisch geprägt. Er hat wenn er einen Glaube hat, hat er einen Glaube in Vernunft. Und in diese Fundamentalist Communities, es geht um ganz was anderes. Es ist mehr eine emotional affektive Verbindung mit Gott, quasi direkt. So leider, ich glaube, das wäre kein Beispiel. Es ist mehr ein Kontrast.
Und würde ich die Nachfrage dazu stellen mal, die Art, wie er das kommuniziert hat, würde das verfangen, würde das funktionieren? Nämlich die Statistik mit dem Glauben zu verbinden?
Ja und nein. Ich glaube, man muss sogar argumentieren, dass wenn man die Gemeinwohl wahrnimmt, tut man was Gutes für sich selbst. Man kann auch argumentieren, und so hat die Puritaner eigentlich argumentiert, die haben ihre eigene religiöse Prägung gehabt, dass was gut für den Commonwealth, für den Gemeinwohl ist, ist auch eine individuelle Glaubensfrage. Man kann das anders verknüpfen. Aber ich glaube ehrlich gesagt, dass diese fundamentalistische Denkensart ist so populistisch, so anti-elitär, dass Statistik werden wahrgenommen als Expertensprache. Und die Gegenargument ist, was wissen Sie über meinem Leben? Ich sehe leider, ich glaube, dass wir müssen von Franklin lernen, wie wir argumentieren, formulieren. Aber ich glaube, einfach Franklin zu lesen, würde niemand überzeugen, der nicht schon ein bisschen überzeugt war. Leider.
Ich habe hier noch eine Frage aus der Zuhörerschaft, aus dem Publikum. Seit wann interessieren Sie sich für Franklin? Was hat Sie für ihn interessiert?
Seit ein paar Jahren. Ich bin eigentlich, wenn es um Forschung angeht, bin ich meistens aktiv im 20. Jahrhundert. Ich bin im Kalten Krieg, im Liberalismus während des Kalten Kriegs bin ich sehr beschäftigt.
Ich glaube, jetzt haben wir ein kleines Verbindungsproblem bei der Beantwortung dieser Frage. Zumindest sehe ich sie nicht mehr. Ich versuche mal ein Signal zu bekommen von meinen Kollegen, die das Technische machen, ob das allgemein der Fall ist.
Jetzt dabei?
Jetzt sind Sie wieder da. Wunderbar.
Okay. Ich weiß nicht, was passiert ist. Warum oder seit wann interessiere ich mich? Ich bin von meiner ich habe früher nicht auf Franklin spezialisiert, aber ich bin sehr auf Fragen von Liberalismus. Ich bin mit diesen Fragen sehr stark beschäftigt und deswegen habe ich angefangen vor 5, 6, 7 Jahren viel über den 18. Jahrhundert zu forschen, weil in Amerika mindestens dort hat Liberalismus angefangen und Franklin spielt eine sehr wichtige Rolle in dieser historischen Entwicklung.
Wunderbar. Dann möchte ich mich an der Stelle ganz herzlich, Andrew, bedanken für die Bereitschaft, diesen Vortrag zu halten, neben Homeoffice, Teaching, Digital Teaching und allem, was da noch ist. Und möchte Sie ganz herzlich einladen, auch in der nächsten Woche hier bei unserer Ringvorlesung dabei zu sein. Wir fangen wieder um 18:15 Uhr an, sowohl auf YouTube als auch auf Zoom. Vielen Dank und auf Wiedersehen.
Vielen Dank.